What if I told you there are people who were declared dead, but somehow came back to life? They were shot multiple times, hanged until breathless, or electrocuted with over 2,000 volts. But still, they survived. These are not scenes from a movie. These are real, shocking stories of people who escaped death again and again. Some say it was a miracle, others say it was pure luck. From broken robes to failed injections, each case will leave you questioning everything and wait until the end because the final story is so unbelievable, it will stay with you long after the video ends. On May 3, 1946, something almost unimaginable happened in the execution chamber. Willie Francis, a young inmate, was strapped into the electric chair and subjected to a brutal surge of 2,000 volts of electricity. But against every odd, he survived. What followed was even more astonishing and controversial. His case remains one of the most chilling and bizarre stories in criminal justice history. Today, we're sharing real-life stories of inmates who, despite facing certain death, survived their own executions. These are not myths, these are documented, jaw-dropping events that defy logic. Welcome to Criminal Records, where we uncover some of the darkest chapters of human history. We begin with the case of Kenneth Smith, a name that sparked legal, moral, and medical debates across the U.S. Smith was convicted for his role in a contract killing in the 1980s. A preacher, Charles Sennett Sr., had hired Smith and another man to murder his own wife, Elizabeth Sennett, so he could collect her life insurance. Smith was paid $11,000 for the crime, but the plan fell apart, and he was ultimately arrested and sentenced to death. After spending over 3 decades on death row, a date was finally set for his execution in November 2022, but the process went horribly wrong. The medical team struggled to locate a viable vein for the lethal injection. As Smith cried out in pain, they punctured his arms repeatedly and even penetrated his muscle tissue. In desperation, they tilted the gurney until his feet pointed upward and his head hung toward the floor, describing a position that Smith later likened to an inverted crucifixion. Covered in blood, the team eventually tried to insert an intravenous line near his clavicle. After nearly 4 hours of failed and painful attempts, the execution was stopped by court order, and Smith was returned to his cell. The ordeal left him deeply traumatized. But the worst was yet to come. On August 26, 2023, Alabama announced that Smith would be executed using nitrogen hypoxia method that had never been tried before in the United States. Authorities argued that this was the only guaranteed way to carry out the sentence after the failed injection. The procedure would involve depriving Smith of oxygen by forcing him to breathe only nitrogen until he lost consciousness and died. On January 25, 2024, Smith was strapped to the gurney once again. Wearing a mask that muffled his voice, he delivered his final words. Tonight, Alabama made humanity take a step back. I leave with love, peace, and light. I love you all. Thank you for supporting me. As the nitrogen flowed, his body shook violently. The entire process lasted 25 minutes. After surviving death once, Kenneth Smith was finally executed. The story of Rommel Broom, another death row inmate, is just as haunting. On September 15, 2009, in Ohio, Broom was scheduled to be executed by lethal injection. Convicted of the abduction, rape, and murder of 14-year-old Trina Middleton, Broom had been on death row for years. His criminal path began much earlier. Born in Michigan in 1956, he moved to Ohio as a child and fell in with a dangerous crowd. Over time, his crimes escalated from car theft to violent assaults, and ultimately, to the horrific killing that put him behind bars. When the time came for his execution, the medical team again faced a terrifying reality. They couldn't find a suitable vein. They tried multiple times on different parts of his body, leaving Broom in visible pain and distress. After nearly 2 hours of failed attempts, the execution was called off. Broom became one of the few inmates in U.S. history to survive an actual execution attempt. His case triggered a heated national debate. Could the state legally try to execute someone twice after a failed attempt? His attorneys argued it was cruel and unconstitutional, while prosecutors insisted justice had yet to be served. The debate raged on for years, and Broom's story remains a haunting reminder of the fallibility and moral complexity of the death penalty system. After being identified through DNA evidence, Rommel Broom was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death by lethal injection. But what was meant to be the end turned into an unexpected and painful ordeal. For over 2 hours, executioners struggled to find a usable vein. They punctured his arms repeatedly, causing immense pain and distress, but none of the attempts were successful. Eventually, the state of Ohio was forced to intervene, halting the execution mid-process. Initially, officials planned to reschedule it just a week later. However, Broom's legal team worked relentlessly and managed to delay any further attempts for years. During that time, Broom even wrote a book about his harrowing experience. Though a new execution date was set for 2022, it never came to pass. On December 20, 2020, Rommel Broom died on death row due to complications from COVID-19, while the state ultimately never carried out his execution. Broom's survival and extended life on death row remain a haunting reminder of how even the justice system can falter. Number 8 on this list is William Jewell, whose story dates back centuries to a time when hanging was a common method of execution, but cases like his are part of the reason why that method was eventually abandoned. In 1740, William Jewell, a young boy at the time, was convicted in England as an accomplice in a brutal attack on a woman named Sarah Griffin. On November 24th of that year, he was hanged at Tyburn alongside 4 other convicts. His body was left suspended for approximately 20 minutes before being pronounced dead and taken to an anatomy theater for dissection, a common practice of the time. But as his clothing was removed and his body was laid on the table, one of the attendants noticed something alarming. Jewell was breathing, albeit slowly. Over the next few hours, his breathing became more regular until he eventually sat up and began to speak. The attending doctors quickly alerted the authorities, and Jewell was returned to prison that same night. It was later discovered that he had likely entered a state of delirium due to the pressure on his neck, which may have shielded him from remembering the hanging. The next day, he had fully recovered. News of his survival spread rapidly, and the public celebrated what many saw as a divine intervention. Ultimately, due to his age and mental condition, he was pardoned and his sentence was commuted to penal transportation. Jewell was exiled to North America and spent the rest of his life in Boston, where it is believed he died around 1805. Number 7 brings us to John Lee, famously known as the man they could not hang. On February 23, 1885, not once, but 3 separate attempts were made to hang him and all of them failed. Born on August 15, 1864, in England, John Lee was convicted at the age of 21 for the murder of his employer, Emma Keyes, in her own home. The evidence against him was mostly circumstantial. He was the only man in the house at the time of the crime, and investigators found cuts on his arm that raised suspicion. Despite his repeated claims of innocence, Lee was sentenced to death by hanging. When the day of execution arrived, he was led to the gallows, the noose secured around his neck, and a hood placed over his head. But when the executioner pulled the lever, the trapdoor beneath Lee's feet refused to open. The mechanism was tested again, and it worked perfectly without him on it. However, as soon as Lee was repositioned, the trapdoor failed again and then again a third time. Each failed attempt shocked the officials present. Eventually, the coroner and authorities halted the execution, declaring the event too disturbing to continue. Lee was returned to his cell, and in light of the bizarre malfunction, his sentence was commuted to life in prison. His story sparked widespread debate and became one of the most unusual cases in the history of capital punishment. Throughout the entire ordeal, John Lee remained remarkably calm, repeatedly expressing his unshakable faith that God would intervene on his behalf. Whether by divine will or pure coincidence, the trapdoor beneath him failed 3 times, and his life was spared. In light of the failed attempts and the public's growing fascination with the case, a judge eventually commuted his death sentence to life in prison. Years later, after persistent appeals and the emergence of new evidence suggesting that Lee may not have been the only person present in the house on the night of the murder, doubts about his guilt began to surface. Eventually, he was declared innocent and released in 1907. What became of him afterward remains a mystery lost to time. Some accounts suggest he died in a mental institution in Tavistock during World War II, while others claim he moved to the United States, became a public speaker, and passed away in Milwaukee in 2009. Regardless of the truth, John Lee has earned his place in history as the man they could not hang. At number 6 is the incredible story of Anne Green, a case that has fascinated historians and scholars for centuries. On December 14, 1650, Anne, a young domestic servant, was sentenced to death by hanging after being accused of infanticide. Born in 1628, she served in the home of Sir Thomas Reed, a local justice of the peace in Oxfordshire. During her time there, she was seduced by Sir Thomas's grandson, Geoffrey Reed, and became pregnant. At just 17 weeks into the pregnancy, Anne suffered a miscarriage. Fearing punishment and public shame, she attempted to conceal the remains, but they were soon discovered. Despite no solid proof of wrongdoing, she was accused of intentionally ending the child's life and condemned to die. And was hanged at Oxford Castle, her body left suspended for 30 minutes to ensure death. Afterwards, she was taken to the University of Oxford's medical department for dissection, a common practice at the time. But what happened next was nothing short of miraculous. For almost a full day, Anne had gone without food, water, and oxygen. Just as the doctors were preparing to begin the dissection, one of them noticed something odd. Her body moved slightly. On closer inspection, they discovered she still had a faint pulse. Shocked and bewildered, the physicians quickly worked to revive her. With warmth, stimulants, and care, Anne eventually regained consciousness and even began to speak. Just days later, Sir Thomas Reed, the very man who had overseen her conviction, died, leaving no one with the authority to reverse her unexpected reprieve. Although some members of the public demanded that she be hanged again, many viewed her survival as divine intervention. In the end, Anne Green was set free. She later married, had 3 children, and lived a peaceful life until her death in 1659. Her story remains one of the earliest and most extraordinary accounts of someone surviving an execution and going on to rebuild their life. At number 5 is the astonishing case of Willie Francis, a teenager who survived one of the most brutal forms of capital punishment, the electric chair. In 1946, Willie, a 17-year-old African-American from Louisiana, was strapped into the electric chair after being convicted of murder. 2 years earlier, in 1944, a local pharmacist named Andrew Thomas was found dead, riddled with bullets. Rumors swirled that Thomas had a dark reputation for abusing young people in the area, leading some to believe Willie may have been one of his victims. For nearly 9 months, the case went unsolved. Then in August 1945, Willie was arrested, allegedly found in possession of Thomas's wallet. But there was no physical evidence tying him to the murder. Even more suspicious was the fact that the gun used to kill Thomas belonged to the sheriff's deputy, Auguste Fuselier, raising serious questions about the integrity of the investigation. Despite the glaring holes in the case, Willie was coerced into signing to confessions without legal representation. His trial was shockingly swift, in just 2 days, and with no defense witnesses or objections raised in court. An all-white jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to die in the electric chair, with no chance for appeal or proper legal defense. On May 3, 1946, Willie Francis was led once again to the electric chair. But what followed shocked everyone. The execution failed. The portable electric chair, known as Gruesome Gertie, had been incorrectly set up by a prison guard who was reportedly drunk at the time. The improper installation prevented the electric current from delivering a fatal shock. Against every imaginable odd, Willie Francis survived. His body convulsed violently as electricity surged through him, but death never came. The botched execution quickly drew national attention. A Louisiana lawyer named Bertrand de Blanc took up Willie's case and filed an appeal to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that subjecting a person to a second attempt at execution after surviving the first constituted cruel and unusual punishment. He also highlighted the many irregularities in Willie's original trial key evidence, including the murder weapon, and even Andrew Thomas's body had mysteriously disappeared before the trial began. Despite the overwhelming evidence of judicial misconduct, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal. And so, on May 9, 1947, exactly 1 year after his initial encounter with the electric chair, Willie Francis was brought back for a second execution. This time, no mistakes were made. As he sat in the chair, moments before the switch was pulled, he turned to a reporter and calmly said, "I'm going to meet the Lord with my Sunday pants on and my Sunday heart." He died that day, but his story remains one of the most disturbing examples of both the fallibility and the cruelty of the American justice system. Number 4 is the story of Allen Eugene Miller, a name that once again puts the spotlight on Alabama's troubling history with executions by lethal injection. On September 22, 2022, Miller was scheduled to be executed for the 1999 murders of Lee Holdbrooks, Christopher Scott Yancey, and Terry Jarvis. Crimes he committed during what was described as a delusional episode. But as with other recent cases in Alabama, the execution did not go according to plan. For an hour and a half, prison officials struggled to locate a usable vein for the intravenous injection. They repeatedly pierced his arms, hands, and feet, but failed each time. Desperate, they began inserting needles into other parts of his body, turning his execution into a nightmarish medical ordeal. Throughout the entire process, Miller remained conscious, enduring every painful puncture. His limbs bled. When it became clear that the execution could not be carried out, the prison staff strapped him tightly to the gurney, tilted it upright, and simply left him there wounded and alone. Nearly 30 minutes later, they returned to remove him from the gurney, treat his injuries, and return him to his cell. Allen Eugene Miller had survived his execution attempt. Following the failed procedure, Miller's legal team pushed for a change in the method of execution, arguing that Alabama had proven itself incapable of carrying out lethal injections safely. His case was the third botched execution in Alabama in just 4 years, sparking a fierce debate over the use of lethal injection as a humane method of capital punishment. Ultimately, the state opted for an alternative. On September 26, 2024, Allen Eugene Miller was executed by nitrogen hypoxia, a method that deprives the body of oxygen. A quiet, clinical, and after years of violent attempts. At number 3 is one of the most unbelievable records in execution history. John Smith, a man who quite literally refused to die. Born in 1661, Smith lived in London and was known for theft and robbery. But before turning to crime, he had served with honor in the British Navy and later fought in the War of the Spanish Succession, taking part in the famous Battle of Viga Bay. After the war, however, he fell into the wrong crowd, and his life spiraled into criminality. On December 5, 1705, he was convicted onto separate charges and sentenced to death. John Smith's story remains one of the most extraordinary examples of survival against death, not once, but multiple times. Born in 1661, Smith was no stranger to crime. After serving as a sailor in the British Navy and later fighting in the War of the Spanish Succession, he fell into bad company and began a life of theft and robbery. On December 5, 1705, he was found guilty of 2 separate crimes and sentenced to death. At the time, Smith didn't appear too concerned about his fate, but on the day of his scheduled execution, his family created a public uproar, desperately trying to ease his suffering. When the moment of truth arrived, Smith was hanged before a crowd of spectators. He dangled at the end of the rope for an astonishing 15 minutes, but to everyone's amazement, he didn't die. Executioners eventually cut him down and rushed him to a nearby house to recover. The trauma he endured led authorities to release him on February 20th, 1706, a rare and almost miraculous act of mercy. Yet what followed proved even more unbelievable. Rather than reforming, Smith returned to his life of crime. Within 6 months, he was arrested again for theft. Despite his prior conviction and the second offense, the court hesitated to pass a harsher sentence due to the unusual circumstances of his previous execution. Once again, luck was on his side. Shockingly, he was arrested a third time for robbery, and it seemed his good fortune had run out. But just days before his trial, the prosecutor unexpectedly died, and with no one to lead the case, Smith was freed once more. Incredibly, fate still had more twists in store. On May 17, 1727, at the age of 66, Smith was arrested yet again, this time for attempting to steal a lock with an accomplice. While his partner escaped, Smith was caught and sentenced to be transported to the American colony of Virginia as punishment. Desperate, he pleaded for physical punishment instead of exile, but the mayor denied his request. Ultimately, he was banished from London, separated from his loved ones, and sent overseas. What became of him after his relocation remains a mystery, but his life stands as one of the most remarkable accounts of repeated escapes from death, earning him a permanent place in the folklore of British criminal history. Next on this astonishing list is the story of Joseph Samuel, a German convict whose fate stunned everyone in 1795. He was sent to England as a prisoner. Years later, Samuel was transported to a penal colony in Sydney, Australia, part of the British Empire's harsh approach to criminal punishment. But Samuel didn't remain confined for long. Along with a group of inmates, he escaped the settlement and returned to England. Not long after his return, he and his gang committed a robbery at the home of a wealthy woman. During the heist, a police officer guarding the property was murdered. Though multiple men were involved, the woman identified only Joseph Samuel as one of the culprits. Samuel admitted to taking part in the robbery, but vehemently denied killing the officer. Nevertheless, with no other suspects identified, he alone was sentenced to death by hanging. On September 26, 1803, Samuel stood alongside other condemned prisoners at the gallows. The ropes used for the executions were designed to support over 450 kilograms, far more than necessary to hang a man. The others were executed without issue, but when it was Samuel's turn, the rope snapped, sending him crashing to the ground. The crowd gasped. A second rope was quickly prepared. Again, Samuel was hoisted into position, but once more, the rope gave way and he fell hard onto the ground, injuring his ankle. Still alive, he was prepared for a third attempt. The rope was double-checked and adjusted carefully, yet it too failed, dropping Samuel for a third time. At this point, the crowd erupted into cheers, chanting for his release. Tension grew as the public began to suspect divine intervention. The chief of police halted the execution and called for the governor. When the governor arrived, he examined the ropes and noted that the same type of rope had successfully executed the other prisoners. Seeing no sign of sabotage, he concluded that Samuel's survival was a sign from above. As a result, Joseph Samuel's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. His miraculous survival, 3 failed attempts at execution, remains one of the most baffling and awe-inspiring moments in execution history. Finally, the #1 spot on this list belongs to a man whose story is so intense, it sounds like the plot of a film. Wenceslao Moguel, born on November 1, 1896, was a soldier in the Mexican army serving under the revolutionary leader General Francisco Pancho Villa. During the height of the Mexican Revolution, Moguel was captured by enemy forces and sentenced to death by firing squad, one of the most brutal and final forms of execution. On the day of his execution, Moguel was shot between 8 and 9 times throughout his body, absorbing bullets to the torso and limbs. Just to be sure, A soldier approached and fired a final shot directly into his head at point-blank range. Believing him to be dead, the firing squad left his body among the others. But astonishingly, Mogwell was still alive. Though severely wounded, he remained conscious and pretended to be dead. That night, he slowly crawled through the darkness, dragging his bloodied and broken body across 3 city blocks until he reached the Church of Santiago Apostol. There, a kind-hearted church member discovered him and took him in, nursing him back to health. Though Mogwell would live the rest of his life with deep scars and disfigurement, he survived one of the most certain forms of execution. His survival remains a chilling reminder of human error, extraordinary endurance, and perhaps divine fate. To this day, the image of his disfigured face is shown as a symbol of survival against impossible odds. His story, like so many on this list, raises powerful questions about justice, destiny, and the unpredictable nature of life and death.